Up next, with a fantastic look at folkloric rewards, please welcome to the stage Lilia Gutnik with From Goldfish to Godmother, a history of the Cinderella story. Please welcome Lilia.
Hi, hello. If you came here for facts or learning, you can just relax. This is story time strictly, and I'm gonna need your help, okay? You're gonna know when, but I'm gonna need your help. Fairy tales, like all forms of human creative expression, are surely worthy of thoughtful reflection, said Professor Alan Dundes in Cinderella, a casebook. Once upon a time, go ahead, relax. Once upon a time, there was a story about a persecuted heroine who got a little magical help, met some royalty, went through an identity test, and married that royalty. And they were happily ever after. You know the story, right? So, just come along with me. So there's a young girl, and she's separated from her mother, subjected to menial labor, and taunted endlessly. Ugh, the persecuted heroine. Okay, so what happens next? She takes a bath, and an eagle snatches her sandal, and then they drops the sandal on the lap of the king. You don't know the story? Of Egypt? No? Anyway, and so the king is like, a shoe? And obviously the reaction to that is that I should marry the woman who owns this shoe. And he looks for her and finds her and they get married. Hooray! So that's great. That story dates back to 7 BC, the story of the slave girl Rhodopis, who marries the king of Egypt. I'm going to go ahead and say that this fair-complexioned Egyptian woman is inaccurate. So just look right past that. We think that this is the earliest recorded version of the Cinderella story. Excuse me, you may be saying, a sandal and a glass slipper, not the same. I see you, Disney purists back there. Where are the stepsisters? Where is the royal ball? Where is the pumpkin? That's the thing about things like stories like Cinderella. Stories that are passed down over generations, they're folklore. They change. There is no one right version. There are hundreds of variants, each reflecting the social and economic realities of the time, and they're everywhere. If the Cinderella story is an example of folklore, what is folklore? It's an artistic and cultural expression. It's a song, it's a story, it's a dance, it's a custom, and it comes from a shared experience of a particular community or group. It's what you do when you raise a glass at a wedding. It's the scary stories you tell when you're sitting around a bonfire. And it's the words you shout in the dark on a Tuesday night, surrounded by the most brilliant and interesting people you know. These customs are how we make sense of the world and how we transmit our cultural heritage. Who said science? Yeah, it is science. I did it, Isolde. Folklore evolves to tell stories of the time. Okay, so 2,000 years ago, Cinderella story had an eagle and a sandal. Isolde asked Lilia, how does this relate to JACKPOT? Bitch, a slave goes from nothing to being a queen because of her shoe. What are you wearing tonight? What are you wearing? What are you wearing? Imagine if your shoe choice changed your entire societal reign. What if you could go from nothing to something because of your shoe? All you need is like one magical eagle. So what are we to interpret from the story of Rhodopis? Okay, in some tellings, she's kidnapped by pirates, and sometimes she's got green eyes, and everyone else has brown eyes, and that's why they hate her, which is wrong. She's kind to a lot of birds. She gets them to eat out of her hand. In some versions, the pharaoh is like presiding over a case, and he's administering justice, and then the sandal falls in his lap, like it would. So maybe the persecuted heroine here, her lucky rise is not so much about luck, but it's just justice being served to a deserving and kind hottie who's unfairly mistreated because she's a little different. It's just a story, you guys. Stop reading so much into it. People just want to marry up and get rich and wear dope clothes. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't sound so bad. Speaking of all that, 17th century France. Let's go to the story that folklorists say is the most influential version. The Cinderella Story, Cendrillon, published by the intellectual Charles Perrault in 1697. This is said to have brought Cinderella into the popularity it is today. So Charles published some serious essays that we don't give a shit about, and then this small book of fairy tales that he wouldn't even publish under his own name. He put it under the name of his son. Cinderella and some other things you may have heard of, like Puss in Boots, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood. It's not bad for a first-time folklorist. You may have heard of this story. It's the Tales of Mother Goose. Oh, you have heard of it. Cool. Fairy tales are not simply works of imagination, but they are the expressions of peasants' hopes and struggles. Who doesn't dream of having your life changed overnight from being oppressed to being in a position of power? Most fairy tales at this time were documented by the aristocratic French women who met and exchanged ideas in salons. As the author Terry Windling writes, the art that these blue-stocking women made of such tales was new and subversive. Each salonier would be called upon to retell an old tale or rework an old theme, spinning them into clever new stories that not only showcased verbal agility and imagination, but also slyly commented on the conditions of aristocratic life. So here's some of that story. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who married for his second wife, the proudest and most haughty woman that ever was seen. She had 2 daughters of her own who were indeed exactly like her in all things. The gentleman had also a young daughter of rare goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. The best creature in the world. So lesson 1, some moms rule. The stepmother forces the young girl to do all the chores. She's done with all her work, and the girl has to sit under the chimney in the cinders, and they call her Cinder Wench. What? Thankfully, the younger one was like, I guess I'll call you Cinderella, because I'm not totally awful. So then there's a royal ball. She can't go, and she cries. And her godmother appears out of nowhere. There's no introduction other than she cries and her godmother appears. So there's nothing to see here. She asks Cinderella to bring her a pumpkin, 6 mice, 6 lizards, and a rat. And then they eat them. No. And then with a wave of her hand, the pumpkin turns into a fine gilded coach, the mice into 6 horses, the lizards into 6 footmen, and the rat into a coachman. Her rags turn into a cloth of gold and silver and are decked with jewels, and her godmother gives her a pair of the prettiest glass slippers in the world. No other glass slippers had even existed, but these were the best one. Okay, so what time does Cinderella have to come back? The oral tradition continues. Thank you, Atlan. So she goes to the ball and record scratch, all the violins stop. Her beauty astounds everyone, especially Sir Prince-a-Lot. So she dances with him until 1:45, and then she runs home, and her clothes transform into rags, and the coach comes back into a pumpkin, and her stepsisters return, and she's like, oh, what have you guys been doing? I've just been sleeping. In her haste, a glass slipper is left behind. Whoops. So, apologies. So she pretends to be sleeping, and I just want to check in here. You remember that Cinderella is of rare goodness and sweetness of temper, but our bitch still uses secret magic, disguises herself, wears bodacious outfits, she sneaks out, and she dances all night with a rich hottie, and then she lies to her family. So this is rare goodness in 17th century France standards, and they're like, she's the best. Yo, Cinderella is metal. Like, she's so cool. I don't know why this isn't a more popular Halloween story. There's like rats who are turning into people? Are you kidding me? Okay, so then she goes back to the ball and she's dressed even more dope, and then she like spends the whole time dancing it up with the prince, like haven't we all been there? And then she doesn't even see when it's midnight and she's like running to get away, and the prince is running after her, but he can't catch up, which is weird because he's like probably pretty athletic and she's wearing heels, but whatever. So then our glass slipper is left behind, the clock strikes midnight, and her clothes transform, and the prince is like, did you see anyone? And the guards are like, nah, I don't know, just some bitch. And then they're like, what? Where'd she go? And then there's a search for the shoe. It's like it's 1,000 years old. Thank you. So then everyone tries it on, and then Cinderella's like, what about my feet? And then it fits, and then they get married, and it's happily ever after. Okay, so we have a persecuted heroine with like a magic godmother, and they met royalty, and then there's an identity test, and everything is great. And the influence of this story is everywhere. There's someone in the back who's like, I got one more drink in me, and then I'm turning into a pumpkin, right? You've said that today. If the shoe fits, wear it. Anyone Hamilton? Anyone? Yeah. You're welcome from Cinderella herself. Credit Cinderella with the suffix Ella, like Barbarella and Cruella. Yeah, they didn't make it up. That was Cinderella. Okay, this is my Annetta's alchemy aside. This is the glass slipper aside. There's a lot of arguments like it couldn't have been a glass slipper. Maybe the word verre, which means glass, was actually the word ver, which is like an old word for weasel fur. And everyone's like, totally, it was probably weasel fur because that's way more likely than glass. Okay, so I did too much research about this weasel fur. Who knew that would be the bluff? And the folklorist that I like the best, and I'm on the mic, so this is what's right. He says, there's no way it's weasel fur because the same story is in Scottish and they don't have that problem. So find your friend who could do a Scottish impression and get them to talk about ver. His point is that slippers of improbable materials are all over folklore. There's like copper and silver and gold. Princesses and fairy tales just have uncomfortable shoes. That's the rule. The tellers of folklore and their audiences see, above all, in these objects the precious and shiny aspects of the material of which they are made, without troubling themselves about the object's resemblance to real life. So just chill out. That's all. It's just a shoe. Okay, so 100 years later, the Brothers Grimm version is published, and it is grim. As in dark and violent. And some people are like, that's the real Cinderella. But it was after the other ones. And they're all real. That's what folklore is. You could make up a story right now and be like, it's Cinderella. And you'd be right. In the Brothers Grimm, a branch is buried in her mother's grave, grows into a tree, and a white pigeon, don't mess with birds, grants her wishes. And there's all these impossible tasks the stepmother makes her do, and the birds help. Again, we have the ball, we have the dresses. She runs away 3 times. There's 3 balls. But the 3rd time, she's not late. The prince sets out tar on the stairs to catch her gold slipper. What? Brothers Grimm. Ugh. When they do all the foot trying on, the stepmother tells her daughters, you don't need to walk when you're queen, so cut off your toe to fit in that shoe. And one's like, I guess, Mom. And then the pigeon is like, there's blood in the shoe. And that prince is like, oh, you're right. Like, that's how he noticed. And then the stepmother says to his other daughter, cut off your heel, because you don't need to walk when you're a queen. But that pigeon is like, there's blood in the shoe. This is the real story. Busted by birds. And then Cinderella does it, and the pigeon's like, that's right. And then they get married, and as they walk down the aisle, and the stepsisters are there at the wedding, the white pigeons fly from Cinderella's shoulders and see the sisters and peck their eyes out. Oh, there are so many animations I forgot. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they are punished with blindness as long as they lived, happily ever after, and a side of vengeance. So it's implied here, vengeance! It's implied here and in many of the Cinderella stories that the magical help from an animal or godmother is her dead mother, protecting her and granting her these wishes. So let's go to 850 AD. So we started at like 2, and then we went to 17, but what is time? We're in 850 AD with the Chinese story of Yi Shen. See, I'm sorry, I'm ignoring your little cards. Yi Shen is the daughter of Wu's second wife, who dies. Her father also dies. I've learned that Chinese stories are very sad. And she has to do all the chores for her unloving and cruel stepmother in the cave where they live with her stepsister. So she befriends a goldfish with golden eyes and scales, and she shares some of her food, and the goldfish grows to be 10 feet long and does her chores with her and hangs out. Goldfish rules. Okay, so her stepmother sees that she's hanging out with this goldfish, and what do you think she does? She does! Oh, you nailed it! She kills it and eats it! Yi Shen is devastated, but she buries the bones of the fish under her bed, and she cries to those bones, and then what do you think happens? Dope-ass threads! She gets to go to a festival looking like a hottie, and then her dumb stepsister is like, is that Yi Shen? And Yi Shen's like, oh shit, and then she runs. She loses a golden slipper. Okay, but this time, there's no eagle. A peasant finds it, and he's like, what am I going to do with one slipper? And then he trades it. And then someone else is like, cool slipper, but how about that other thing? And they trade it, and they trade it, and they trade it until it gets to a king who's like, what am I going to? I got to marry the person who has the slipper. Meanwhile, the stepmother's like, I have to boss somebody around. So she bosses the stepsister around, turns her into a slave. And the stepsister's like, this sucks. They get into a fight, and the cave buries them. So now we have magic fish and a cave and the mean family. Oh, I love Cinderella stories. I told you it's so metal. There are similar stories in Malay, Indonesian descent, Vietnamese, and Tibetan ethnic groups. There are 700 versions of Cinderella. I'm not even joking. 2 folklorists, both women, which was pretty unusual in the late 1800s, Marianne Rolfe Cox and Anna Brigida Ruth in 1951, credited with collecting all of this text about Cinderella and analyzed it. There is a Cinderella who runs away using the hide of a donkey. Sometimes the goldfish they kill is a cow. In 23 of the stories, Cinderella is a man. Who knows what's next? You guys, let's make a Cinderella story right now. Okay. So once upon a time, there was a persecuted heroine named Personella? Okay, Personella. Oh no, and she was like forced to put on pants with buttons and go to meetings, and people had to explain things to her that she definitely knew on her own. Okay, and then she was forced to file like another TPS report, and she sought the help of a magical Wolpertinger. Yeah, you guys are getting it. Okay, and then there was going to be like this amazing event she really wanted to go to, an art salon, where the cool royal curators would be present. And she was like, oh, Harvey, I want to go to the art salon, but I have no stories to tell, and I just have these boring pants. And Harvey was like, I got you, girl. And he gave her like a jacket of leather and a badass black dress, because that's the rules at art salon. Okay, and then like what uncomfortable shoes should she have? Knee-high boot. Did I say? Fluvogs? Sure. Brand new. It's your story now, bitches. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so she gets Fluvogs or unbroken Doc Martens is what I was thinking, but you do you. And she goes to art salon, and it's awesome! And she goes up to the curator, and she's like, I have a pitch for a story, and it's about science and ships. And the curator's like, cool, but then Personella's like, oh no, it's almost midnight and Bart closes because I can't afford to live in San Francisco. Oh no! So then she runs off. But then her fluvogs, it makes more sense to be fluvogs because docs would never leave your feet. Okay, so fluvogs, like one leaves, and then maybe it should be the pitch. It should be the pitch that's left behind. Okay, so it's the pitch that's left behind, and then the cool curator is like, who doth writ this pitch? And then they like go on to social media, and they're like, I will marry the person who wrote this pitch. And then Personella like slides into her DMs and is like, yo, it was me who wrote that pitch. And then they come to the next Odd Salon and tells her story, and she's welcomed by the Odd Salon fellows and members and patrons, and her life is full of adventure and art and intellectual pursuits, and she lives happily ever after. Oh my God, so I'm sorry, I'm done now. Whew. Popular tales mark the critical point at which imagination, hallucination, and literature, 3 phases of human experience, meet and remain still distinguishable.